Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So my name's James Black. I'm Assistant Director of the Defence and Security Team at RAND Europe, which is part of the broader RAND Corporation. There's my name in case I have an existential crisis whilst on stage. So for those of you not familiar with RAND, RAND is the democratic world's largest non-profit policy research organisation. It was set up in 1948, originally focused very much on national security problems. If you've seen the movie Dr. Strangelove works for Bland, which is Stanley Kubrick's not-so-subtle rip-off of RAND. A more relevant and recent pop culture reference would be that we're in the Oppenheimer movie. I don't think we're in Barbie, but I'm working on that for the sequel. And we nowadays work across all areas of policy, supporting governments around the world. I'm obviously talking here today on the basis of our work in relation to strategic minerals. There's a number of different threads that I'll be kind of drawing upon. RAND is a very large organisation, and I won't pretend to be even aware of all the research going on there. But we do have a supply chain initiative based out of the United States, which does a lot of research in this space. We have colleagues in the UK doing a lot of work for the UK on supply chains and broader kind of resilience and critical national infrastructure topics. We do a lot of work for the European Commission and the EU on this topic of critical minerals. And indeed, one of our major projects is we maintain for the European Commission a website which you can all search, but it provides an update quarterly monitoring of supply chain risk for critical minerals sourced from conflict-affected and high-risk areas as defined by EU Regulation 2017-821, which I'm sure you've all can recite by heart. And we've done a lot of work for the Australian government in this space as well. So I'll try and kind of draw some of that together in my comments here, and then open up, obviously, for the Q&A in a moment. So as we've just heard, rightly, the kind of geopolitics of critical minerals is a hot topic. And I say a hot topic really in three senses of the word hot. So it's hot in terms of the media attention that's belatedly starting to get. It's hot in terms of the increasing kind of tension and indeed conflict between states. And it's hot also in the sense of the impact of a warming planet and the increasing climate and environmental dimension to this challenge. So we're faced really with a kind of classical wicked problem. And we've rightly heard a lot just now about dependence. And we very frequently talk about risk when we're talking about this topic. But I want to, I think, bring in a new word to this discussion today as well, which is that of uncertainty. So the reason I say that is risk is a language and a way of thinking that governments and indeed private sector executives are very comfortable with. So to take the example of the UK, as we're here today, the UK maintains a national risk register which outlines a wide variety of geopolitical, environmental, technological, terrorist, military, etc., risks that might affect UK government, UK economy, UK society. Private firms similarly maintain endless risk matrices at varying levels of kind of quality and rigour, and they often report these to their shareholders and their owners. But the problem with talking about risk in this area is that it implies that we have a firm understanding of both elements of risk. So whether we can quantify the probability of an unwanted event occurring, so in this case a disruption to the supply of one or more critical minerals, but also that we can quantify and understand the impact. Now that quantification is important because it's on the basis of quantification that you can start to monetize things. So you can start to make balance of investment decisions, whether as a government policymaker, as a legislator, or as a private sector executive, based on your priorities and based on that understanding of risk to take your finite resources, be they political or financial, and allocate them to mitigating different types of risk. Now that is possible to an extent with critical minerals, but I would argue that in many areas we are still actually dealing with uncertainty. So what I mean by that is that we don't have a full understanding either of the probability that disruptions will occur or of the costs and impact of disruption. So we have a patchy understanding and we're trying to play catch up with a problem that we don't yet fully understand and for which we don't have a common language for talking about, either between multiple governments and nations or between government and private sector, or with wider society and the general public. And now, why is that the case? Well, first of all, we have to say that obviously supply chains, as we've heard today, are complex, competitive, contested, congested, transnational, multi-stakeholder, and crucially, rather opaque in many areas. So most governments do not have a full understanding of lower levels of supply chains. That's true even of large companies in many cases. And so we often do not understand fully our areas of dependence. And this has been highlighted in some ways by the recent experience of the COVID pandemic, where the first order effects of supply chain disruption due to COVID was something that could be fairly easily predicted. But some of those second and third order cascading disruptions came in surprising places that people hadn't anticipated. At the same time, the threats and hazards that we face to our supplies, global supplies of critical minerals, are a mix of the relatively well-known and understood, and then what has previously been called unknown unknowns. So there's a broad range of kind of PESL-M risks that we face. Obvious examples being things like war at the extreme end, but more broadly political competition between states, instability and corruption within nations, the impact of technology, the impact of climate, the impact of environmental disasters, the list goes on. So our dependencies are not always clear, and indeed they are rapidly changing. And when we think about the green industrial revolution that nations are embarking upon, it is clear that there is sharply and indeed exponentially growing demand in some areas for some of these strategic minerals, and our dependency is therefore only increasing in some regards. At the same time, the impact of disruption, as I've mentioned, is not always very clearly understood, or at least it's not understood enough by all of the right people. And that's true both for kind of exporting nations, but also for the consuming nations and consuming companies and indeed individuals that make use of the various products and services dependent upon the supply of these strategic minerals. And again, I'd cite COVID as a recent example of these kind of cascading impacts that can have, not just on the economy, but on broader society. Relatedly, government priorities are not always clear. This varies from nation to nation, of course. Some nations have been more forward-leaning in setting out clear kind of strategic minerals or critical minerals strategies and policies and identifying their priorities and where they want to focus their finite political and financial resources to address risk, but others are still playing catch-up. And indeed, the effectiveness of different levers for mitigating risk remains uncertain. So those levers may be legal, they may be regulatory, political, diplomatic, financial, or of course at the kind of the pointy end, law enforcement, intelligence, and military. So how do we grapple with this deep uncertainty that we're facing, given it's something that governments are inherently uncomfortable with, as well as private sector decision makers? I think I'm going to recommend three things in the interest of time, and they won't really surprise you coming from a professional researcher who advises policymakers, but I'm going to say that the first thing we need is more evidence. So there's a lot of data out there. There are lots of good resources. The projects I mentioned for the European Commission, where we track supply chain and various risks from conflicts-affected countries, draws on about a dozen different data sets that are provided by a mix of governments, NGOs, and private sector players. So there is data out there, but the challenge is often bringing it together and making sense of it. And that's where I think initiatives such as the UK's new Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre, as established in line with critical minerals strategy in the UK, are a positive, if belated, step forward. It's then applying various analytical techniques to that data to get from sense-making to something that is a basis for decision-making. And here there are lots of techniques, things like assumptions-based planning. We heard in the previous session on cyber about kind of tabletop exercises, wargaming, horizon scanning. There are lots of different ways you can run through different scenarios, consider the impact of different events, and then try and understand how resilient and robust governments, nations, economies, or individual companies are to dealing with potential disruption of certain supplies of strategic minerals. So that's the first piece, evidence and understanding. The second piece is then information and intelligence sharing across the value chain. So that's not just governments and businesses exchanging information on where they see risks and dependencies and what government priorities might be, but it's of course also governments talking to each other, including in fora such as this, about what the collaboration opportunities are, where there are areas of mutual interest, where there is understanding and common understanding to be built, and where things might be done together because of course no nation can have full resilience or full independence on something like strategic minerals, and so inherently some element of cooperation is always going to be required, even for the most autarchical regime. So the final point then really, having built that evidence understanding and shared that understanding with the people who need to know, is to take as holistic and inclusive approach of the problem as possible. We've rightly just heard that it's a red herring to focus only on extraction when you don't think about refining or downstream. We similarly need to think about a wide variety of stakeholders that we're going to engage in these sorts of conversations. We heard a lot in the cybersecurity session about public-private partnerships, and I think that's incredibly important, but I would go even broader. So it's not just about government and industry, it's also about academia, it's about the media, and I think crucially it's about broader society. So starting to have a conversation with society about the dependencies and about risk, and about what individual companies, individual people, families, how they may be affected by some of these disruptions. In the same way that we had to have a kind of dialogue with our national populations around COVID. And I think that's becoming increasingly important, and it's really at the basis of that idea of resilience and taking a broad societal approach to resilience that I think is essential to go after the sorts of wicked problems, be they strategic minerals, be they cyber, be they broader supply chain disruption of the kind that we've been talking about this afternoon. So very happy to talk more about this in the Q&A and afterwards. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.